The sovereign integral, a new model of existence. Written by James Mahu. The limits of my language means the limits of my world. The quote from Ludwig Wittgenstein, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1922. Author's introduction. Consciousness is the most important subject that is the least understood. Take a moment and think about this statement. We know more about the universe than a single consciousness. I do not equate the brain and its neural circuitry as a surrogate of consciousness. They are distinct entities, having distinct capacities and purposes. The brain, inside a protective skull, analyzing and computing information of a single lifetime, and consciousness, which begins at the outer perimeter of self-knowledge like an expanding frontier, is an infinite, unbounded sovereign, enmeshed in lifetimes and dimensions too numerous to enumerate. Consciousness is elusive to the measurements and detections of science because it is perfectly subjective. There is not one consciousness that shares a single, identical experience with another. Consciousness is unique to every life form, every single one, giving consciousness the dubious distinction of being the most difficult thing to map or make explicit, due to the two halves of its reality, infinite complexity and perfect subjectivity. Throughout history, cartographers tried to envision a map of the world. They used verbal reports from travelers and explorers, or they themselves were the traveler and explorer. They transcribed these reports into maps that presented a vision of a territory. One could even call it a theory of the planet's geographical face. Tens of thousands of iterations were made mapping the Earth, adding details like islands, mountain ranges, rivers, three-dimensional topography, making adjustments when new lands were discovered or conquered. Today we have satellites, fractal geometry, and powerful computers to make this fine-grained resolution available to anyone on the internet. We need more cartographers to join the effort of mapping the face of consciousness, particularly artists. Since the advent of modern-day science, religious scholars, psychologists, neurologists, biologists, physicists have debated the nature of consciousness. Some artists have tried to capture its invisible face, the entity behind our human face, using paint or dance or photography or music or film or writing. Sometimes, perhaps by accident, they capture its imprint in our very human world. When they do, there can be a recognition that the artist and their work had sprung from a new source, a kind of inner reality that outlasts misunderstanding. And with a quiet but resolute passion, it seeks to be understood. Understanding consciousness is decidedly undervalued in our culture. While our higher education systems provide diverse philosophic opinion and our religious teachings purport to know the nature of the human soul, consciousness remains defined by either an intellectual abstraction or the rounded words of poetry. Interestingly, consciousness is not a real subject. There is no branch of human endeavor that is charged with the study and analysis of consciousness. Again, I'm not talking about the brain. While I have repeatedly, even at this early onset, stated that consciousness and the brain are distinct, let me go one step further and make the distinction between consciousness and soul. The sum total of agreed-upon definitions of soul would fill one sentence. Soul is generally thought to be our spiritual, eternal self. God, Allah, Yahweh, Brahman, etc. is its creator. It may, through an unknown process, be created in the likeness of God. The soul, after death of the mortal coil, attains a heavenly state if it abides by certain rules. The afterlife, good or bad, is conditioned by the behaviors as a human being on earth. This is the general framework for the concept of soul. Consciousness, on the other hand, is not the exclusive domain of any particular religious or spiritual organization. It is the one thing that is completely present and infinite, and therefore, consciousness is inclusive of all things. The shorthand version of consciousness, at least in my explorations, is that it is a synthesis of a sovereign identity, self, and an integral identity, whole. Thus, my term for consciousness is the sovereign integral. The term sovereign integral was first brought out in 1998 when I launched the Wingmakers website. It was an embedded definition in the philosophy papers of the initial release of materials, a relatively minor mention in an array of content that included music, artwork, philosophy, a novel, and poetry, wrapped inside a mythological story. In this paper, the sovereign integral is center stage. It is the focus. It is presented not as a part of a mythology, but as the most real thing that exists. I want to stress that the sovereign integral is a non-fiction paper with radical subjectivity, as only consciousness can evoke. You can substitute the word consciousness with the term sovereign integral. I use them interchangeably. It is simply a new face or facet of consciousness that this particular paper is proposing as an answer to the question, why is consciousness so elusive? And what is it anyway? Some might be tempted to say, it isn't elusive, people just don't listen hard enough to the whispers of their soul. There is some truth to that perspective, but is there a specific kind of listening that makes the sovereign integral more tangible and real? That is another purpose of this paper, to draw the sovereign integral out onto a lighted stage, so it can be revealed, at least at the skeletal level, and from one vantage point, mine. This paper is a theorem on the structure and nature of consciousness. The sovereign integral, in terms of its description, in the two-dimensional confines of paper or canvas, cannot be more than a theory. There is no proof or scientific explanation of the sovereign integral. It does not distill down to mathematics. That is part of its compelling nature. It cannot be defined. And here's why. The sovereign integral is infinite in scope, and because it is sovereign, it is infinitely unique. It is expanding in a completely unique trajectory of experience, and therefore, its understanding, expression, perspective, orientation, knowledge, wisdom, memory, all are unique. As it evolves its uniqueness, it redefines its very existence. In other words, the sovereign integral is not static or absolute or set upon a destination that acts as its end goal. Furthermore, the sovereign integral is not beholden to any organization or creed or ethnicity or socioeconomic status. It is independent and therefore sovereign. This is a very important distinction. The sovereign integral is a consciousness of infinite and unique expansion. It occupies both the dual and the non-dual realms simultaneously. The sovereign is the individual self, the core identity that is always present even when the body ego is not. It is the bridge between lifetimes, and it is the lifetimes as well. However, as it occupies a human body, its identity is assumed by the body ego, assisted by the ubiquitous signposts of the social program. The sovereign and its unique connection to the integral are dismissed by the body, ego, and social program as if it were a child that is being dismissed from the dinner table. Carry on by all means, but please do it somewhere else. The ego emerges as an outgrowth of the survival instinct and later in life as the protective shield for the harsher realities of the social program. The ancestral DNA confers tendencies and talents to the body, which can also have an effect on the ego. Now we have the body and ego sitting at the dinner table, enjoying their dinners in peace and quiet, tuned into the social program. The sovereign has been dismissed. The integral repelled. A little bit about the integral. The integral is most similar to the term spirit in religious and esoteric texts. It has a magnetic quality and acts as the core attractor of the sovereign, because without this, the sovereign could easily become distracted and its expansion of understanding falls subject to entropy. While these phases occur, free will intermixed with the social program, it remains that the fundamental nature of the sovereign is expansion to the integral. The hands of evolution are attached to the body of the integral. The integral is the intelligence of all realms as a result of being the collecting point of experiential information. It is the companion to everything, and it is, therefore, the one thing in essence that enfolds all life. The two entities at the table, body and ego, immersed in the social program, are, by comparison, exclusionary. They are the tribal cliques that dominate the landscape of human social culture. It is precisely through this tribalism that the integral is thwarted by the body-ego social program, the triad that obstructs the sovereign integral consciousness, and therefore muddles comprehension of its presence and purpose. I maintain that this is purposeful. It is the means through which the sovereign can remain in separation from the integral and, in a sense, lose itself in the body-ego. This allows humanity to be human. There is joy in the enchanted flesh, and human experiences cannot be contrived as though they were products of factories. They require oblique light and separation from both the sovereign and the integral. This paper is not designed to improve anything or replace anything. It is not even designed at all. You see, I wrote it, diagrammed it, and painted it for myself. Once it was collected and I could see the value in it, I decided that I would share it. That is the sum total. There is no publisher, no editor, no organization, no artists, and no designers. No other voices, other than the translators, entered this work. With that qualification in mind, I submit that the Sovereign Integral paper accurately represents my explorations as a cartographer of the face of consciousness. It may be radically different from your own, and for that, I acknowledge no claim to it being more valuable or better than anything else. It is possible that these maps of consciousness and existence only apply to me. That is, after all, the nature of the Sovereign Integral. Subjectivity is the default state in a free will, infinite multiverse where individual consciousness is interwoven with all others. I want to acknowledge that this project rests on the shoulders of a great many sovereigns who informed these maps. Their work and contribution became my bridges. I do not make any claim that these maps represent a path to realization or enlightenment. They are, at most, an on-ramp or starting point for holding and examining the sovereign integral consciousness in your imagination. This paper exists partly as my hope that others will want to examine the sovereign integral and allow it enough space and time in their lives so they can welcome it. The other part is because the mythology of consciousness is the most interesting of all mythologies. The reality makers that we all are observe and learn. We watch our lower expressions in duality wrestle, tame, or transform their consciousness to include the non-dual worlds and form an integration based on a larger, more dimensional love. There is a fundamental truth, and often people get anxious or frustrated with this truth, but it must be accepted. The consciousness of the sovereign integral is not accessible to the five senses. It can only be accessed through the imaginative faculty, and this faculty is not in the brain or pineal gland or the body or the ego or even the heart. It is a sensory receiver of the higher mind, that part of the mind that cares about redefinitions and expansion into the integral. It is not interested in human achievement, psychic, or spiritual phenomenon. The higher mind, the noble mind, imagines the sovereign integral and invites its consciousness into the human domain with a specific intention, expansion to the integral state. As mentioned earlier in this introduction, consciousness is the most important subject that is the least understood, and therefore, that continuum is the widest dichotomy of human knowledge in both the individual and collective sense. This is precisely why this subject is critical to understand, because it, perhaps more than any other factor, can create behavior that is integral-minded, yet grounded in the appreciation for the uniqueness of the sovereign. Your identity can shift, and given this natural ability we have as humans to explore identities, we need to be nimble, always with the outlook of deepening our understanding of our sovereign, while expanding our reach to the integral. We need to be aware of our resonance points with art, culture, consciousness, social norms, education, and the shared reality of being human in this time and place. There is a phrase, just tell the truth. However, in the case of metaphysics and consciousness, there is only theory relative truths. These relative truths are really just opinions, varying opinions, sometimes quite opposite opinions. The point is, one cannot tell the truth of how we exist, why we exist, and what we truly are or how we came to be. There is no set of words in any language that can adequately describe or explain the intricate and fractal nature of consciousness as it slips between dimensions, lifetimes, and infinitely varied experiences. If this could be explained, this paper would be about that. The very best that any of us can do is to explore maps of consciousness and be sensitive to our resonance points. Is there a feeling of expansion or constriction? This resonance is a feeling more than an intellectually reasoned-out experience. This material may feel slightly cool to the touch. This is due to its focus on the mind of consciousness, rather than the heart of consciousness. It is more directed to the higher mind of consciousness, which is particularly open to concepts that are unbounded, unmoored, dynamic, evolving, enigmatic, self-directed, and yet reasonable, perhaps even logical. Let's take a look at how consciousness is popularly defined. Merriam-Webster Dictionary, full definition. Consciousness. 1. The quality or state of being aware, especially of something within oneself. 1b. The state or fact of being conscious of an external object, state, or fact. 1c. Awareness, especially concern for some social or political cause. 2. The state of being characterized by sensation, emotion, volition, and thought. 3. The totality of conscious states of an individual. 4. The normal state of conscious life, regained consciousness. 5. The upper level of mental life of which the person is aware as contrasted with unconscious processes. It is the third definition of consciousness that is most relevant to us. However, I do, as you will see, redefine what totality means. Consciousness is an infinite canvas, so vast that a single paper, like the sovereign integral, can only paint a single pixel. I had to carefully choose which pixel to paint. The sovereign integral consciousness is all-inclusive. You could be an atheist or a devout religious scholar and still see how these maps of consciousness could bolt on to your present belief in consciousness or the human soul. As I mentioned before, this paper is not meant to replace anything. You may still be an atheist or a devout religious scholar after reading this paper. There is no need to change your social network, life's work, or a single relationship. This paper is not about any of that. The sovereign integral is like an imaginary being. It is not a human being. It is not even an enlightened being. It is infinite and interdimensional in both dual and non-dual realms, which, as impossible as that may sound, we nonetheless can imagine it as us. The philosophy that originates from the sovereign integral is best described as expansion. Anything that is stale, crystallized, pinned down like a specimen and can be described one day the same as the next, is not from the sovereign integral. Consciousness is like weather. It is always changing. Anything that describes a destination or endpoint or culmination of effort or achievement of purpose is not from the sovereign integral. It expands in infinitude. Thus, with such an imaginary being as the sovereign integral, how does it live and breathe in our world, the shared reality of humans that we all live in? If science can never pin it down, if religious and spiritual texts are too vague, how do we stand a chance to ever bring this entity into our human sphere in a meaningful way? That is precisely what this paper is about. It is my belief that it is the function of artists to bring the sovereign integral consciousness into human culture so that its imprint, its energetics, and its perspective can be more deeply felt as an inspirational factor in all of our lives.